The lonely stranger. The rain poured down relentlessly, turning the streets into glistening rivers under the pale glow of the city lights. The alien hobbled through the narrow alleyways, its mismatched limbs clicking against the ground with every painful step. Its body was a mix of organic and mechanical parts, patched together poorly. The once glorious armor it wore was now cracked and smeared with dirt, a pitiful remnant of a past life. It clutched its side, trembling. People walked past, humans bundled in coats and holding umbrellas, their faces turned away from the strange figure. Some quickened their pace, whispering in fear or disgust. To them, the alien was just another unwanted creature, a symbol of everything they didn't understand and didn't want to. Zeke, the alien, had no idea how it had ended up here, abandoned on a planet it didn't know, in a city that didn't care. Its memory was a blur of explosions, betrayal, and pain. The sharp ache in its missing leg was a constant reminder of what had been taken from it. Finally, Zeke's strength gave out. It collapsed in front of a rusted metal fence, its head hitting the cold, wet ground. "Help," it whispered, though it knew no one would. The world faded into darkness. Jake had always been a tinkerer. His garage workshop was filled with half-finished robots, old engine parts, and tools scattered about in organized chaos. He liked fixing things. It made him feel like he was putting some order back into a messy world. Tonight, as the rain hammered against the tin roof, he was elbow-deep in a broken drone, muttering curses under his breath. The faint sound of something heavy hitting the ground outside pulled him from his work. Jake frowned. His workshop was in the rougher part of town, where strange noises weren't uncommon. Still, something about this sound was different, like someone had fallen. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The beam of light swept across the scrapyard, reflecting off the puddles. Then he saw it, a heap of metal and flesh slumped against the fence. Jake's first instinct was to back away. "What the hell?" he muttered, his heart racing. But then the figure groaned and shifted weakly, and Jake saw the pitiful state it was in. It wasn't just a machine. It was alive. Jake hesitated, his mind screaming at him to leave it alone. Helping an alien. That was trouble he didn't need. But the way it looked, barely holding itself together, stirred something in him. Against his better judgment, he crouched down. "Hey," Jake said cautiously. "Can you hear me?" The alien's head turned slowly, its glowing yellow eyes flickering like dying lights. "Help, please," it rasped. Jake sighed. "Damn it," he muttered. He wasn't the type to walk away, even if it meant risking his neck. With a grunt, he hauled the alien to its feet, or foot, as the other leg was completely missing. It leaned heavily against him, its weight almost too much to bear. Back in the workshop, Jake laid the alien on an old cot, pulling a blanket over its shivering form. Up close, he could see how damaged it was. Wires dangled from its torso, sparking occasionally. The stump where its leg should have been was crudely patched with bits of metal. Whatever had happened to it, it was a miracle the thing was still alive. The alien stirred, its voice weak but grateful. "Thank you, human." Jake blinked, startled by the clear words. "You can talk." "Yes," the alien said, its voice mechanical but full of emotion. "My name is Zeke." "Zeke, ha. Well, you're lucky I found you," Jake said, grabbing a toolkit. "You look like you've been through hell." Zeke gave a weak nod. "War. Betrayal. I ran. But they took my leg. Left me to die." Jake didn't press for details. He had questions, too many to count, but now wasn't the time. Instead, he focused on assessing the damage. "You're a mess, buddy," he muttered. "But I think I can help." Zeke's eyes glowed faintly. "Why would you help me?" Jake paused. It was a fair question. He didn't know why, exactly. Maybe it was the challenge of fixing something so broken. Maybe it was the loneliness he saw in Zeke's eyes, a loneliness he recognized in himself. Because someone should. Jake said simply. Now stay still. This is going to take a while. As the rain continued to fall outside, Jake worked through the night. He cleaned Zeke's wounds, replaced frayed wires, and patched up its armor with whatever scraps he could find. Zeke watched silently, its glowing eyes following Jake's every move. "You're good at this," Zeke said after a while. "Yeah, well, fixing things is kinda my thing," Jake replied without looking up. "Though you're a bit out of my usual range." Zeke managed a faint chuckle, a strange sound that was part mechanical, part natural. "You surprise me, human." Jake smirked. "Stick around. I'm full of surprises." For the first time in a long while, Zeke felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, it had found the one person in this unforgiving city who could help it stand again. And maybe that would be enough. The unlikely bond. The following morning, the storm had finally subsided, leaving the city in a blanket of mist. The streets were quieter, with only the occasional car driving by. Inside Jake's garage, a soft hum filled the air as Jake worked tirelessly on the alien. His hands moved quickly, but with precision, adjusting tools and fixing parts. The broken leg of the alien, which had been nothing more than a twisted mass of metal and wires, was now carefully removed and replaced with a new frame, a rough yet functional prosthetic leg. Zeke, still weak but conscious, lay on the cot, watching Jake work. Its yellow eyes flickered, glowing faintly, as it absorbed every movement. It didn't know why it felt a strange sense of calm in this human's presence, but it did. After years of running and hiding, of being betrayed by its own kind, Zeke had never known anyone who would take the time to care, let alone help it. Yet here was Jake, a stranger in a strange land, not only helping but showing understanding. "Does it hurt?" Jake asked, glancing up from his work. Zeke hesitated before answering, unsure of how to explain the sensation of being in a body that didn't feel like its own. The new prosthetic leg, though made from parts Jake had found in his scrapyard, was strangely comforting. It was functional, if not pretty. But the alien had learned long ago that survival didn't depend on beauty, it depended on necessity. "It's strange," Zeke replied in a low voice, "but bearable." Jake paused and looked up, seeing the alien's hesitation. "You don't have to hide it. If it hurts, just say it. I can fix it." Zeke nodded, grateful for the offer, but also feeling something it hadn't expected, a sense of dignity. Despite its broken body, it felt like Jake treated it as an equal, not a thing to be pitied or feared. For the first time in what felt like ages, Zeke began to relax. "Tell me about yourself," Jake said, taking a step back to admire his work on the prosthetic. "Where did you come from? Why were you running?" Zeke looked away, unsure if it could trust this human fully. After all, it had been betrayed by its own people. What guarantee did it have that Jake wouldn't turn it in to the authorities or worse, sell it for a reward? But something about Jake's voice, steady and kind, made Zeke reconsider. There was no immediate danger here. No one was going to come crashing in and dragging it away. Jake was different. "I am from a distant world," Zeke began, its voice filled with sorrow. We were a proud people, strong, intelligent. We built cities, created technology far beyond what you could imagine. But then war came." Zeke's voice broke slightly as it spoke. "We fought, and many of us died. I was part of a squadron, elite soldiers sent to battle. But one of our own betrayed us. They cut off my leg, left me for dead. They thought I was a liability. It was only after I woke up that I realized I had been abandoned." Jake listened carefully, not interrupting, as the alien's story unfolded. He could see the pain in its eyes, a pain that ran deeper than physical wounds. It was the kind of pain that Jake could relate to in his own way. He'd never been part of an alien war, but Jake knew what it was like to feel abandoned, to lose hope. The weight of loneliness could crush anyone, even a being as powerful as Zeke had once been. I didn't know where to go. The others, my kind, had turned their backs on me. I fled here, hoping to escape, but it seems I've just traded one form of danger for another. Zeke continued, its voice softening with each word. I can't go back to my people. I can't trust anyone. Jake's hands stopped moving as he processed Zeke's words. The alien's story was tragic, but what truly stood out to Jake was the loneliness that clung to every syllable. It wasn't just the war, the betrayal, or the injury. It was the isolation. Zeke had been left in a world full of enemies, with nowhere to go, no one to turn to. And now, here it was, relying on a human, a complete stranger. Jake shook his head, an idea forming. Listen, I don't know everything you've been through, but I do know that you're not the first person, or alien, to feel abandoned. I get it, all right. I've been alone too, just trying to survive, trying to fix things that are broken, including myself. Zeke's eyes widened slightly. You understand. Jake gave a short, dry laugh. More than you think. He paused. I don't know what kind of people you come from, but I can tell you this. You're not alone here. At least, not with me. If you're willing to trust me, I'll help you fix whatever is left. Zeke looked up at Jake, uncertainty still clouding its thoughts. But for the first time since it had crash-landed on Earth, it didn't feel like a stranger. It didn't feel like a weapon or a broken thing. Here, in this humble garage under the flickering light of a lamp, it felt something else. Maybe hope. Maybe the possibility of healing. Maybe just a glimpse of what it had once been, back on its home planet. I will trust you, Zeke said, its voice steady. Jake nodded. Good. Now let's get that leg on, and see if we can't get you walking again. As Jake attached the prosthetic leg to Zeke, the alien took its first few tentative steps. The new leg wasn't perfect, but it worked. With every step, Zeke gained confidence. The bond between them, unspoken but undeniable, began to form. Two beings from different worlds, two survivors, now finding their way forward together. Jake smiled as Zeke stood up on its own, the faintest hint of pride in his eyes. You're a fast learner. I think we'll make a good team. Zeke nodded. Yes, a team. And just like that, the loneliness that had once defined both of their lives began to fade. They weren't alone anymore. Together, they would face whatever the future held, whatever dangers, whatever challenges, because now they had each other. Little did they know, the troubles they had left behind were far from over. The world outside the workshop still carried its dangers. But in that moment, they were not just an alien and a human. They were a team. And that was enough. Shadows of the past. Days passed in a blur. And the weather outside shifted with the seasons. The city slowly began to thaw as winter melted away into the reluctant warmth of early spring. But inside Jake's workshop, time seemed to stand still. Jake and Zeke worked side by side, both focusing on the task at hand. They were building something. Whether it was a friendship, survival, or just a fleeting sense of purpose, neither of them could say for certain. But something had changed in the alien, something that hadn't been there before. Zeke's leg had been repaired, more or less. It was a work in progress, but it was getting better with each passing day. The alien was walking almost without hesitation now, moving with a fluidity that wasn't there when Jake first found it. Zeke's physical form, although still rough and patched, had begun to resemble something like its former self. But the alien's eyes, the look in Zeke's eyes had changed as well. It wasn't just the quiet fear of being hunted anymore. There was something else, something buried deep beneath the surface. A flicker of memory, of pain, and something that Jake didn't fully understand. One evening, as the two of them worked on a new project, something that would help Zeke adapt to Earth's technology, Jake noticed Zeke staring out of the small window, its gaze fixed on something far beyond the confines of the workshop. The alien's eyes were distant, unfocused. "You okay?" Jake asked, setting down his tools. He had learned that when Zeke grew quiet like this, it usually meant the alien was retreating into its own mind. Zeke didn't respond right away, and Jake didn't push it. But then, after a long silence, Zeke spoke, its voice softer than usual. "I was part of something. Something bigger than myself," Zeke said, barely above a whisper. "Before the war." Jake leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms. He didn't speak, just let the alien continue. He knew that pushing too hard wouldn't help. "I was trained to be a soldier, an elite fighter. We were the best. My people, we built great ships, advanced weapons. We had the power to shape entire worlds. But," Zeke paused, as though searching for the right words. "But when the war came, everything fell apart. We became monsters." Jake stayed quiet, letting Zeke unravel the story in its own way. "We fought against an enemy we couldn't understand, an enemy that used fear and deception as weapons. It wasn't a war of survival, it was a war for power. And in the end, power corrupted us," Zeke said, its voice trembling slightly. "I didn't understand at first, but I saw it. How we treated our own people, the weak, the injured. We abandoned them, left them to die. We became what we fought against." Jake felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he listened to the alien's words. He had known war, had seen the darkness it left behind. But this was something different, something darker. "You were betrayed," Jake said softly, as though the words themselves were a burden. "You were left behind." Zeke nodded slowly, its gaze still fixed on the distant horizon. "Yes, they cut off my leg and left me on the battlefield. The others didn't even look back. I was an inconvenience, a burden. They wanted power, and anyone who couldn't fight was useless. I thought I could make a difference. But in the end, I was just another casualty of their ambition." Jake's mind raced. The alien had been abandoned by its own kind, cast aside like an old tool. But Zeke hadn't given up. No, it had survived, even when its world crumbled around it. Jake could see the fire in Zeke's eyes, the unspoken strength that had carried it this far. "You're not a burden, Zeke," Jake said firmly. "You're here, and you're alive. And that counts for something." Zeke turned to face him, its yellow eyes now focused, sharper than they had been in days. "I don't know if I can ever go back to what I was. I don't even know if I want to. My people, they're gone, Jake. They don't care about me." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of Zeke's words. "Well, I can't speak for your people, but I'm not going to abandon you. You don't have to go back to them. Not if you don't want to." For a long moment, Zeke said nothing. It just stared at Jake, as if trying to understand the sincerity in his voice. Then, slowly, the alien smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile, but it was there. It wasn't the kind of smile that came from happiness. No, it was more like a smile of acceptance, of a fleeting peace. "I never thought I would find someone like you," Zeke said quietly, "a human who would care. I thought you were all like them." Jake chuckled softly. "Not all of us are bad, Zeke. Some of us are just trying to get by. I'm not perfect, but I know what it's like to feel alone." Zeke took a deep breath and stood up, testing its leg again. It still wasn't perfect, but it was working. Jake watched it with a quiet sense of pride. Zeke had come a long way in just a few days, and Jake, in turn, had learned a lot about himself. There was something about helping Zeke that filled a hole in his heart, a hole he didn't even know was there until it began to close. The silence between them was comfortable now, not filled with the weight of past regrets or fears of the future. But as they stood there, something shifted in the air, a subtle tension that neither of them could ignore. Zeke had spoken of its betrayal, its loneliness, and its fears, but there was something else, something still hidden in its past. Something that Jake didn't know yet, but he could feel was coming. The kind of shadow that had followed Zeke across galaxies. Zeke's voice broke the silence, low and cautious. There are others, those who betrayed me. They might still be looking for me. And if they find me, they will not stop until I am gone. Jake's eyes narrowed. Who are they? What are they? They are called the Syrians, Zeke said, its voice tinged with dread. They are hunters, soldiers, and mercenaries. They seek power, control. They do not forgive. Jake's stomach tightened. He didn't know much about aliens or intergalactic politics, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about Zeke anymore. The past was catching up, and it was coming fast. We need to prepare, Jake said, his voice resolute. They won't stop until they find you, Zeke, and when they do, they'll come for both of us. Zeke nodded slowly. I don't know if I'm ready for this. You don't have to be, Jake said with a reassuring smile. But we will be ready. Together. And as the weight of their situation settled in, Jake and Zeke both knew one thing for certain. The shadows of the past were closing in, and the fight for survival had only just begun. A new beginning. The days that followed felt like a quiet lull before the storm. Jake and Zeke continued their work together, a delicate dance of progress and preparation. Despite the looming threat of the Syrians, the two of them managed to build something that had been absent for a long time. Trust. For Zeke, it was a fragile thing, born of necessity and survival, but it was real. And for Jake, it was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. In helping Zeke, he had found a sense of purpose beyond the confines of his lonely workshop. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the city's skyline, Jake sat at his workbench, fiddling with a small circuit board. Zeke stood nearby, adjusting the straps on its prosthetic leg, testing its balance. The air was filled with the sound of tools scraping against metal and the quiet hum of machinery in the background. How's the leg holding up? Jake asked, not looking up from his work. He had become accustomed to Zeke's presence, though it still felt strange to think of the alien as a companion rather than a project. Zeke took a few steps, its movements still cautious but growing more confident with each passing day. Better, it said, its voice tinged with a hint of pride. It feels more like mine now. Jake smiled to himself, glad to hear that. Good. You've come a long way. The quiet between them stretched on, comfortable in its stillness, but Jake knew that it wouldn't last forever. The world outside, the one they had both tried so hard to escape from, was still out there. And it was beginning to close in. Just as he was about to speak again, Zeke turned toward the small window, its eyes narrowing as it looked out into the evening light. The alien's senses were far sharper than Jake's, and he had learned to trust them. Something's coming, Zeke said quietly, its voice low and steady. We can't stay here much longer. Jake followed Zeke's gaze but saw nothing. The streets were empty, save for a few straggling pedestrians. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. What do you mean? Jake asked, his tone hesitant. Zeke didn't answer immediately. It only took a deep breath, as if it was gathering its thoughts. The Syrians, they'll find us soon. I can feel them. Closing in. Jake stood up, a sudden sense of urgency filling him. Are you sure? Yes, Zeke said, its eyes glowing faintly with a quiet intensity. I don't know how long we have, but we have to leave. Now. Jake's mind raced, every instinct screaming at him to run, to hide. But he couldn't shake the feeling that it was too late for that. They couldn't hide forever. All right, he said, his voice firm despite the knot in his stomach. We'll get everything packed. I know a place, out in the hills. We'll be safe there for a while. Zeke nodded, its expression unreadable. I'll follow your lead, human, but I will not run forever. Jake didn't respond. Instead, he hurried to gather a few tools, some spare clothes, and what little food he had left. They didn't have much time, and there was no telling what the Syrians were capable of. The last thing Jake wanted was to find out firsthand. As they prepared to leave, A strange silence fell over the workshop. The sense of impending danger was palpable, thick in the air. Every creak of the building, every shifting shadow outside, felt amplified. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath. By nightfall, they were on the move. Jake drove his old beat-up van down the winding roads that led out of the city. The van, while not much to look at, was reliable. He had spent years fixing it up, and it had served him well through more than one rough patch. Beside him, Zeke sat quietly, watching the landscape unfold through the cracked windshield. The alien was more at ease on Earth now, but that didn't stop the tension from radiating off it. They reached the hills just as the first stars began to twinkle in the dark sky. The road grew narrow, the trees thick on either side, blocking out most of the light from the city below. Jake parked the van in a small clearing and turned off the engine. "We'll camp here for the night," Jake said, his voice low. "It's not much, but it's better than being out in the open." Zeke didn't respond immediately, its gaze still fixed on the darkness beyond the clearing. "This place is peaceful," it said after a moment, almost as if it was speaking to itself. Jake smiled faintly. "Yeah, I guess it is. I used to come out here to get away from everything. It always helped clear my head." Zeke turned toward Jake, its eyes narrowing as if considering his words. "I never had peace before," it said quietly. "Not like this. Only chaos. War." Jake's heart tightened at the alien's words. He could sense the depth of Zeke's grief, the weight of its past. It was more than just the loss of a home or a family. It was the loss of an entire way of life. The alien had been born into a world of conflict, where survival meant destruction, where every relationship was built on power rather than trust. "We all need a little peace," Jake said gently, glancing over at Zeke. "You've been through a lot, but you're not alone anymore. You don't have to carry it all on your own." Zeke was silent for a long moment, and Jake thought maybe the alien hadn't heard him. But then Zeke spoke, its voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to live without war," it admitted. "I don't know how to be normal." Jake turned to face the alien, his expression serious but kind. "You don't have to be anything other than yourself, Zeke. We're all just trying to figure it out." For the first time in a long while, Zeke looked like it believed the words. The alien nodded slowly, though its gaze was distant, still haunted by the memories of its past. As they settled down for the night, the distant sounds of the forest surrounding them, Jake and Zeke both knew that this was just another brief moment of peace. The Xyrians were still out there, and soon they would find them. But for now, in this small clearing in the hills, they could pretend for just a little while longer that they were safe, that for once they could simply breathe without fear. And in that moment, as the stars shimmered above them, both Jake and Zeke allowed themselves to believe in the possibility of a new beginning, even if it was only for tonight. Hunted. The stillness of the hills was deceptive. The forest around them seemed serene, with the sounds of distant crickets and rustling leaves filling the air. The night sky stretched endlessly above, and for a brief moment, Jake allowed himself to relax, breathing in the fresh, cool air. The quiet felt almost normal. Yet, even in the peace of the woods, both Jake and Zeke could sense the weight of their circumstances hanging over them like a storm cloud, ready to break. They had only just started to settle in for the night when a strange, unsettling feeling crept through the air. Zeke stood near the edge of the clearing, its sharp alien senses alert. Jake, though less sensitive to the unseen dangers around them, could feel the shift in the atmosphere. It was as though something was coming, something they couldn't escape. Zeke's voice broke the silence, its tone low and tense. "They're here." Jake stiffened, his heart skipping a beat. "Who?" "The Xyrians," Zeke said, its eyes narrowing in the darkness. "They found us." Jake's breath caught in his throat as he quickly grabbed for the bag of supplies they had packed, his hands shaking with urgency. He had known the peaceful night wouldn't last, but the reality of it was still a punch to the gut. The Xyrians were not a force to be trifled with. These were the same hunters who had destroyed Zeke's life, and now they were coming for them both. "We need to move now," Jake said, voice tight. Zeke didn't hesitate, its figure already blending into the shadows, moving with a quiet fluidity that was almost unnatural. Even with its prosthetic leg, the alien's movements were swift, precise. Jake grabbed his flashlight and followed, the beam cutting through the thick underbrush in front of them. His mind raced, weighing their options. There was no hiding from the Xyrians. They were too skilled, too relentless. The only choice they had now was to run and hope they could find a place to hide before it was too late. As they pushed deeper into the woods, Jake could hear the distant sound of a ship's engines humming softly through the trees. The Xyrians had arrived on the ground, no longer relying on their usual methods of scanning for targets from the sky. This time, they were coming in with boots on the ground. The forest grew darker as they moved further from the clearing, the trees blocking out what little light the moon offered. Jake's thoughts were consumed by the question, what would they do if the Xyrians caught up with them? Zeke had already told him that the Xyrians wouldn't stop until they had completed their mission. They would either kill Zeke or bring it back as a trophy. Either way, Jake didn't want to be part of that nightmare. "Stay close," Jake urged, his voice barely above a whisper. Zeke nodded without a word, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They were close now, closer than Jake had ever been to the full force of what the Xyrians were capable of. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, every instinct in his body screaming at him to find safety. But there was no safety, not anymore. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a faint crackling sound, followed by the low hum of alien voices. Jake's blood ran cold as the sound drew closer. "They're getting closer," Jake said, panic rising in his chest. "We need to move faster." Zeke shot him a sharp look, as though urging him to calm down, but it was hard to think clearly when every fiber of his being screamed for escape. The Xyrians were skilled trackers, relentless hunters who knew how to hunt down prey in the darkest corners of the universe. But as they moved deeper into the forest, Jake realized something. They weren't just being hunted by the Xyrians. The alien hunters weren't the only danger. Something else was out there, something darker and more unpredictable. Jake's mind flashed back to a conversation he had had with Zeke earlier, when the alien had shared its past. The betrayal, the war, the truth about the Xyrians. They're more than just soldiers, aren't they? Jake had asked, his voice edged with suspicion. The Xyrians, they're mercenaries, aren't they? Zeke had remained silent for a long time before finally speaking. "Yes," Zeke had answered. "They were once a great force, an army. But now they are a band of mercenaries, hired for their ruthlessness. They will stop at nothing to capture what they want. And they will use anyone, anything, to get it." As the sound of the Xyrians grew louder, Jake realized that he wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. Zeke was no longer just an alien stranger to him. He was a friend who had trusted him when no one else had. Jake's mind made up with a sudden clarity. He wasn't going to let them take Zeke. He wasn't going to let the Xyrians tear apart the only bond he had left. With renewed determination, Jake pushed forward. "We keep moving," he urged. The forest grew thicker, more dense as they ran. The moonlight flickered through the canopy above, casting long shadows on the ground. In the distance, the hum of the Xyrian soldiers grew louder, echoing through the trees like a slow-moving storm. Zeke remained steady by Jake's side, though it was clear the alien was struggling to keep up the pace. The prosthetic leg, though functional, was not built for this kind of speed. Jake glanced over, concern in his eyes. "You're doing fine," he reassured. "Just stay with me." But Zeke was not listening. The alien's attention was fixed on something ahead, something that made its body tense with recognition. Jake followed Zeke's gaze and saw nothing at first. But then, in the distance, he heard it, the faint rustle of movement, too deliberate to be the wind. Before he could react, Zeke was already in motion, darting forward with a sudden burst of speed that left Jake in the dust. Jake cursed under his breath and sprinted after the alien. They came to a small ridge where the forest thinned, offering them a brief moment of respite. Zeke crouched low to the ground, its eyes scanning the area. Jake reached the ridge and took cover behind a large tree. He was breathing heavily, his chest tight, but he had to focus. The Xurians were close now. They wouldn't stop until they had Zeke. "We can't outrun them forever," Jake said, his voice filled with a grim resolve. Zeke looked back at him, its face expressionless but determined. "We don't have to outrun them, Jake. We just need to be smarter." Jake frowned, unsure of what Zeke meant, but before he could ask, the ground beneath them rumbled, and the air seemed to crackle with tension. The hunt had truly begun, and this time it wouldn't be so easy to escape. The final stand. The forest was eerily quiet as Jake and Zeke crouched low, waiting. The sudden, sharp rumble of engines in the distance made the air feel heavy with tension. The Xurians were closing in, and they were not the kind of enemies that let their prey escape once they had locked onto their target. Jake's heart hammered in his chest, and despite the cool air, sweat dripped down his forehead. Zeke stood still beside him, its alien form almost blending in with the shadows of the trees. Its glowing yellow eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any signs of movement. Jake could feel the energy between them shifting. This was no longer about simply surviving. It was about fighting back, and Zeke was ready to make that stand. "They're not going to give up, are they?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. Zeke shook its head, the faintest movement, but Jake could see the determination in the alien's posture. "No, they don't know how to give up, but neither do I." Jake swallowed hard. "What do we do now?" Zeke's voice was low but filled with purpose. "We fight." Jake stared at Zeke for a long moment, taking in the alien's words. There was something in Zeke's eyes now, something he hadn't seen before. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was a cold, calculated resolve, the kind of resolve that came only from surviving too much loss, too much betrayal, to ever give up again. And Jake realized that for the first time in their short time together, Zeke wasn't looking to hide. Zeke wasn't waiting to run. The alien had come to terms with something that Jake had yet to fully grasp. If they wanted to survive, they would have to face the Xurians head-on. "We need to take them out," Jake said, his voice a bit firmer now, as if he were speaking to himself more than to Zeke. Zeke nodded, its eyes narrowing. "I've learned a lot about the Xurians over the years. They rely on speed and firepower. They hunt in packs, but they underestimate their prey." The alien paused, turning to face Jake fully. "And they've underestimated me." Jake's pulse quickened as he understood what Zeke was saying. "You have a plan." "I do," Zeke replied, a glint of determination in its eyes. "But it's going to take everything we have. I need you to trust me." Without waiting for an answer, Zeke motioned for Jake to follow, and they both began to move swiftly through the dense forest. The ground beneath them was soft and damp, but their movements were quick, calculated. They didn't speak as they went. There was no need for words. Everything was about action now. Jake's heart raced, his mind a blur of thoughts. The Xurians were merciless, and he knew Zeke had a history with them, one that was filled with pain and loss. The idea of facing these hunters was a terrifying one, but with Zeke at his side, Jake felt a strange sense of hope, a flicker of strength he hadn't known was there before. Zeke had survived the worst, and now it was time to make sure the Xurians wouldn't have the chance to destroy them both. They came upon a small clearing, the trees opening up to reveal a rocky outcrop overlooking the forest below. Jake had no idea how Zeke had led them here, but somehow it felt like the perfect spot for what they were about to do. Zeke crouched down and began assembling something from the various tools and materials Jake had packed. Jake watched in silence, realizing that Zeke had been planning this for far longer than he had known. "What are you building?" Jake asked, his curiosity piqued. Zeke glanced at him, a faint smile playing at the corners of its mouth. "A distraction. One that will give us the upper hand." Jake furrowed his brow, but didn't ask more questions. Whatever Zeke was doing, Jake trusted it. For the first time, he wasn't just a sidekick to an alien. He was part of something larger, part of a plan that could change everything. Within minutes, Zeke had set up a series of small devices, hidden carefully among the trees and rocks. Jake had no idea what they were, but he could tell that each one was vital to the plan. Zeke had always been resourceful, and this moment proved it. "We need to make them think we're still in the forest," Zeke explained, its voice steady. "If they believe we're scattered, they'll split up, and that's when we hit them." Jake nodded. "All right, what's the next step?" Zeke's eyes glowed brighter now, an eerie light in the shadows. "We wait." The sound of the Tsirians' heavy footsteps grew closer. The low hum of their ships echoed through the trees. Jake's muscles tensed, his hand clutching a makeshift weapon, a heavy pipe he had picked up earlier. He wasn't used to this kind of fighting, but right now, he didn't care. He was prepared to do whatever it took to protect Zeke. Zeke was still focused, its eyes scanning every movement in the trees. It seemed like an eternity before the first of the Xyrians appeared. A tall, imposing figure clad in heavy armor. The Xyrian soldiers had long, sharp blades that glinted menacingly in the fading light. They were armed to the teeth, every inch of their bodies designed for maximum lethality. As the Xyrian soldiers stepped into the clearing, Zeke didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, the alien sprang into action. It leaped from its position with incredible speed, launching itself toward the soldier. The alien's prosthetic leg, despite its rough design, propelled it forward with a force that knocked the Xyrian off balance. Zeke's metallic fist collided with the soldier's helmet, sending it tumbling backward. Jake took a breath and followed suit, charging forward to strike. He swung the pipe with all his might, catching another Xyrian in the side. The soldier staggered, but it was only a temporary blow. Jake's heart pounded as the Xyrian retaliated, swinging its blade in a wide arc. The fight was chaotic, fast, brutal, and intense. But the Xyrians hadn't expected the sudden counterattack. Zeke's strength, combined with Jake's unexpected ferocity, threw them off. They were outnumbered, but the alien knew how to fight dirty, and Jake was learning quickly. Just as the battle seemed to reach a fever pitch, Zeke triggered the devices it had set up earlier. A series of explosions rocked the ground, sending the Xyrians into disarray. Smoke and debris clouded the air, and the soldiers scrambled for cover, temporarily blinded. Zeke and Jake didn't waste a second. They pushed forward, striking when the Xyrians were vulnerable. The distraction had worked, and for the first time in this fight, they were on the offensive. The battle raged on for what felt like hours, but eventually, the tide turned in their favor. The remaining Xyrians, battered and confused, retreated. The forest fell silent once more, save for the heavy breathing of Jake and Zeke. Jake stood over a fallen Xyrian, his legs trembling from the intensity of the fight. He had never imagined he would be capable of something like this. But now, standing side by side with Zeke, he realized something. They had won. They had stood their ground and fought for their survival. Zeke stood next to him, its glowing eyes dimming with exhaustion. "That's only a small victory," it said, its voice quieter than before. "They will come back. And next time, there will be more of them." Jake looked at Zeke, his own exhaustion weighing on him. But there was a fire in his eyes. "Then we'll be ready for them." And for the first time since they had flowed into the forest, Jake truly believed it. Hope rekindled. The stillness of the forest was broken only by the sounds of their breathing, heavy, ragged from the battle. Jake wiped the sweat from his brow, his body sore and battered from the fight. But his heart was still racing. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of what they had just endured, but also something else, a flicker of hope. They had survived. Against all odds, they had survived. Zeke, though just as exhausted, stood tall beside him. The alien's form was slightly damaged, its once glowing eyes dimming with fatigue, but there was a quiet strength in its presence. The battle had been brutal, but the Xyrians had underestimated them. Zeke had been right. They had underestimated their prey. And now, with the Xyrians temporarily driven off, it felt like the world had opened up to them in a way it hadn't before. But Zeke's voice, low and steady, cut through the quiet. "This is not over, Jake. The Xyrians will return. They will send more. And next time, they may not be so easy to deal with." Jake knew that Zeke was right. The Xyrians had retreated, but not for long. They were a relentless force, and they would come again, stronger and more prepared. But that didn't mean Jake was going to give up. He couldn't. Not now. "We'll figure it out," Jake said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "We have time. We'll find a way to make sure they never get close again." Zeke turned toward him, its yellow eyes softening for a moment. You are different from others, Jake. You are not afraid to fight. You do not abandon those who are in need." Jake smiled faintly, though it was more of a grimace than anything else. "I'm not much of a hero, Zeke, but I won't let them take you. Not after everything we've been through." Zeke seemed to consider this for a moment. It had seen war, betrayal, and countless battles before. But this was different. It had fought beside Jake, not as a tool or an object to be discarded, but as an ally. Zeke's people had been brutal, unyielding, and merciless. But here, with Jake, it had found something it had never expected. A friend, a human who would stand beside it, no matter the cost. "Thank you," Zeke said quietly, its voice filled with something that resembled gratitude, something the alien hadn't allowed itself to feel in years. I have never known anyone like you." Jake nodded, though he didn't quite know what to say. He was no hero. He wasn't even sure what he was anymore. But standing there with Zeke, in the quiet aftermath of battle, he felt something stir inside him, something that had been buried for a long time, a sense of purpose, of belonging. He wasn't just trying to survive anymore. He was fighting for something greater. "We need to move," Jake said, breaking the silence. "We can't stay here too long. The Xyrians will find us eventually." Zeke nodded, its posture stiff but determined. "Where will we go?" Jake thought for a moment, glancing around the clearing. The dense trees and rocky outcrops would be enough to conceal them for a while, but it wasn't a permanent solution. They needed to find somewhere safer, somewhere the Xyrians wouldn't be able to track them so easily. "I know a place," Jake said. "A cabin. Far off the grid. It's remote, hidden. It'll be our best shot at laying low for a while." Zeke's eyes brightened slightly, though there was still a trace of skepticism in its voice. "And after that?" Jake took a deep breath. "After that, we rebuild. We prepare. The Xyrians may be relentless, but we're not alone anymore. We'll fight together. We'll make sure they never get what they want." Zeke seemed to consider this, its gaze turning back toward the horizon. The promise in Jake's voice was enough to give it a small measure of peace. For the first time in a long while, Zeke allowed itself to believe that there was hope, that maybe, just maybe, there was a future beyond the war, beyond the endless pursuit of survival. Perhaps, with Jake by its side, Zeke could find something more, a place to heal, a place to grow, a place to be more than just a soldier, more than just a weapon. The two of them set off through the forest, the path ahead uncertain, but their steps filled with a newfound purpose. As they traveled, the light of the stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, casting a soft glow on the path they walked. The world around them was still and peaceful, but Jake knew that wasn't the end of the story. The Xyrians would come back, and when they did, it wouldn't just be a fight for survival. It would be a fight for everything they had built. The friendship, the trust, the hope that had sprouted from the darkest of places. But for now, as they made their way through the forest, Jake and Zeke allowed themselves to believe in the quiet possibility of a future where they were not just fugitives on the run, but survivors, fighters who had each other's backs, no matter what the universe threw their way. And in that quiet moment, they both felt it. The spark of hope rekindled. It wasn't much yet, but it was enough to keep them going. Together, they could face whatever came next. And this time, they wouldn't back down. They wouldn't run. They would stand, fight, and survive, no matter the cost. The Xyrians might have thought they could take everything from them, but they hadn't counted on this. Jake and Zeke were no longer alone. They were a team. And together, they would rebuild what had been broken.